Hello YouTube, new evolving rep range episode today. And again, we're going to dive deeper into something that was already mentioned, but needs to be detailed a little bit more. So I've discussed the fact that each evolving rep range in the program is going to represent a variation of tonnage because it evolves. So it's not static. And you understand also that the more evolving rep ranges you have in the program, the more of an evolution you have to track. In a sense, this can be pinpointed as a weakness because it does mean that you have to be much more aware of what is going on. But on the other hand, that change and that flexibility gives you the potential to adapt. And adaptation within the program is key. And in my opinion, the way I envision programming, the more advanced you are, the more of a flexibility and an adaptability you're going to need to progress, the more complex the program needs to become. Novices can stay with stuff that is simple, minimalistic, and repetitive. As someone who is more advanced in muscle building, you're going to have to need a variety. And that is where the nature of evolving rep range comes in and the multiplication of them, because eventually you might end up like me where 90% of my rep ranges are evolving at all times. And what that is going to create too is that you will have movements that are going to be in the same line of specificity, which are called variations pretty much, that are going to share evolving rep ranges, meaning that they are both going to evolve. And since they sort of follow the same path towards strength progression, it's going to raise a lot of questions. Because I personally envision my lifts as movement patterns. And so that creates big families of lifts, which across the board are going to share the same characteristics. That doesn't mean, however, that I'm going to apply the same rep ranges to them. Quite the opposite. I personally think that each rep range is going to represent some value of volume and intensity. And that you need that to be clearly defined, meaning that I've explained that in past videos. An evolving rep range that goes from 2 to 20 reps is not a good evolving rep range because it's way too big of a range and it's going to take way too long for the range to complete itself and then go back to zero. And that creates a bunch of issues of strength progression. How are you going to manage progressive overload? Look at how much intensity you get when you do 2 reps and then 20 reps. In reality, a 2 to 20 evolving rep range represents a progression scheme for an entire program. It's more something that would be applied as an ideology. For one rep range, it's overkill. So you need to shrink that. And as you shrink it, you also understand that it's going to fall somewhere. An 8 to 12 is more skewed towards volume. A 15 to 20 is even more skewed towards volume, which is 15 to 20 is the max I would go to. My max for myself is 15 reps. I never go above 15 reps. And something that is a 2 to 3 or 2 to 4 or 2 to 5 is much more intensity based. So you see that that spectrum of volume and intensity is also represented with evolving rep range. So you already have that axis to take care of. And now you have the vertical axis of the variations because each variation exists on that spectrum. So how do you manage that? Well, the easy way would just be to balance it out, meaning that regardless of the lift, if the lift is skewed towards intensity or volume, you would still want a balance of those values within it. So let's say your deadlift is more skewed towards intensity. You're the type of person that progresses well with pulls from the floor that are intense in low rep ranges. Okay, this means that the range of the evolving rep range is going to be always on that side, but you're going to pick one extreme and the other. So for example, you might pick a deadlift evolving rep range that is going to be 1 to 3 reps or 2 to 4 reps. That's your high intensity stuff. And within that evolving rep range that is already high intensity, the highest representation of the intensity is going to be the lowest rep range. So it's, for example, if you do 2 to 4, 2 is your extreme in terms of intensity. Now, within that same idea of prioritizing intensity, you're going to pick a variation. Let's say you pick Romanian deadlifts. You still want to push it in terms of having as little reps as possible. You could do something like a 5 to 7 reps on the RDLs, 5 to 8 reps, 5 to 10 reps. It still represents something that I would consider to be a decent amount of exertion while at the same time providing volume, because you will find that a big issue that people have is they pursue a movement pattern and they only apply the same principle of programming to it, and eventually that that practice and that application of the idea of programmation fails. And it fails them in terms of also getting bigger. So you want that range. And you'll see also that as the range exists, it's going to provide you with the two values. And I explained that in the past, but as they evolve, you would, in terms of optimization, want the day where you're only going to do 2 reps of deadlift to be matched with the days where you're going to push the rep range as high as possible for the remaining deadlift. So on the day where you do 2 reps on the deads, you would want to be able to get 8 on the remaining, and if possible, to get multiple reps of 8. This is where I personally believe that sandbagging is acceptable for evolving rep ranges, because they are anti-sandbagging in a sense, meaning that if you do something like a 6 to 10, you should get a 10, 9, 8, 7. Getting a 10, 10, 10, 9 is not the point of the evolving rep range. You could have done a static rep range if that's what you wanted. But when it comes to actually just pursuing higher volume, repeating sets that you know are a bit too easy is okay, because it's for the sake of accumulating tonnage. Understand that at any point you can just push the pedal to the metal and actually get more reps, or actually get into a rep scheme that makes more sense. But that would be only when the first rep range that was most intense is going to slowly move towards more volume. So once that intense rep range of the deadlift goes from only 2 to 4, 3, 2, now look at all of the tonnage that creates. It gives you a possibility to either push intensity on the remaining deadlift, or just still be high volume, which is what it's supposed to be like. It's what you intended for that variation, but it's going to take back its rightful place as an evolving rep range. So you'll push the ability to go back to failure, and you will get 1 rep less for each set. That was for intensity. For volume, the same thing can be applied for people who, for example, like high volume for bench. You could be doing one movement, like your main bench, in something like a 6 to 10, and your high volume stuff in something like a 12 to 15, a 15 to 18, and the same relationship would have to take place. They exist in different sides of the spectrum, but it's always the same calculus and the same application you're going to apply. The principle doesn't change. And that is what I would call the synchronization of the evolving rep range, because I think that it would be much easier for you, and I'll make a video about that, but I personally envision in my mind every single movement pattern I do that fall into the line of specificity as a tree. And this is the reason why I spoke about that horizontal axis and the vertical axis. For me, exercise variation and exercise selection is vertical in my head. It makes the most sense because that way I can have a hierarchy. My main movement, that is most likely going to be my strength work as well, is at the top. And then I rank every single movement that heed and abide by the same movement pattern, and they go down all the way down until something that is completely unspecific. So for example, for me, my horizontal press tree, a family tree or genealogy tree, whatever you want to call it, would be bench, and then spotter press, close grip bench, and then would be something like the push-up, the diamond push-up, and all the way down I would have bended flies, I would have dumbbell semi-flies, etc. But they will all fall into the same pit of brainstorming when I'm going to research my rep range, because I want the volume and intensity to be matched. And you will find that the beauty of it is, if your exercise selection is intelligent, the work is going to be done for you. Because you will most likely have in your program a mix of lifts that already by default have a nature and a tendency to go towards one thing or the other. For example, I spoke about Romanian deadlifts. In my opinion, Romanian deadlifts are skewed towards reps and high volume. Another thing that is skewed towards high volume that I just cited is going to be flies. Don't do a 3 to 5 with flies. That is logical. Most people don't even think about it. I will make a video describing the reason why certain lifts fall into that category. You will find that it has to do with the dangerosity of the lift, the ability to resist muscular failure and structural failure, etc. But for you, that is a value that is very easy to just pinpoint when you write down all of the lifts. And when you do that, you can just categorize each lift, apply its own rep range to the lift, and then just look at the mix. Does it make sense? And if it does make sense, go and do it. Try it in the gym and see how it goes. I would always advise you to apply a specific rep range to a specific lift. Just because you're going to train in a specific line of movement pattern doesn't mean that they have to be the same rep range. And even small modifications can be a big difference. For example, the difference between a 3x5 and a 5x5 is big. The difference between a 6 to 10 and an 8 to 12 is big. You don't realize it until you try it. But the modicum of progression, the ability to repeat effort and all of that changes drastically. And all of these are tools that you can use for progression. All of that is for progression. So that is the big portion of synchronizing all of those movements that you need to take into account. If you're a novice, keep in mind that I advise you to only apply the evolving rep range to your strength work and then let it spread throughout the program so that you get more time. Because as you understand, if you're a novice, you're already blessed with low variation, meaning that I personally also think that the more people advance, the more they have to include variations because they need to find ways to get tonnage from every possible source. As a novice, it's not needed. So as a novice, you're comfortable in knowing that you can just have your main movement pattern and slowly tinker with it with the evolving rep range. And once you add the variation, you can keep that variation in the static rep range. And when you're comfortable with it, you can apply an evolving rep range, etc. That is, to me, my ideal vision of that teaching that I'm providing with the evolving rep range, is that I want to catch people early on in their training so that the practice of the rep range that evolves is just a second nature to them. It's going to be much tougher for people who've never heard of them or haven't really applied that in their training, and now they have to go and just revamp the entire program because it's going to be a culture shock. And I want to avoid that as much as possible. But of course, if you're in that case, keep in mind you need to take it slow as well. So that is the more practical aspect of the synchronization, and understand also that that synchronization is going to have, to an extent, also some communication aspects between lifts that are not in the same movement pattern line of specificity, but it's lesser, meaning that if we look at the big tree, well, what I really call the tree is essentially a branch, and it's a branch of one of two trees. It's either the upper body tree or the lower body tree. And so every single movement pattern that is on the branch of that tree still uses the legs, it still uses the lower back, it still uses the glutes. And so while it does mean that there's going to be a repercussion in terms of fatigue in between them, it's less important, but it needs to be taken into account. Because when you program a rep range for squat, you need to look at how you're programming the deadlift as well. If you're going to get super high volume and kill yourself on squat on Tuesday, most likely the evolving rep range on the first day needs to be adapted for deadlift. You need to apply a variation that is going to let you get away with that extra fatigue, etc. And I say that why? I say that because in my view of programming, which is the gentleman split, the communication between the two trees is almost non-existent. Meaning that the idea that there's a CNS fatigue and that killing yourself on the deadlift is going to have an application and an implication for your strength on the bench press, I've not noticed. I do think that there is a correlation in terms of overall recovery if you don't eat or sleep enough, but in terms of muscular fatigue, training your legs is not going to make your bench more tired. There are certain small muscles and some small details that might matter. For example, if you kill your upper back, you might be less tight on the bench press, but this is really minimal. This is why I allow myself to just separate the trees of upper and lower, because I want the ability to just look at the branches as line of specificities, and regarding them in that scope is much easier than just throwing them all together on one tree, because for the way I teach and the way I try to present my ideas, it just makes it more blurry. So that's going to be that for the synchronization. Understand that while I'm not going to just do the work for you because it's your body, it's your program, if you have a question and you, for example, wonder if one lift goes well with another lift and how you're supposed to actually make the rep range work, you can actually ask that in the comments. Me or other people on the channel who use evolving rep range can help you with that. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.